Imagine watching your daughter die in a hospital bed while you're stuck in a gunfight against an armored super soldier you can't seem to kill no matter what you throw at him. Now imagine that same daughter turns up alive 13 years later in Sydney with no memory of who she is, a mechanical heart beating inside her chest, and the same unkillable monster, now a full cyborg flying around in his personal airship, hunting her down to rip that heart right out of her. Subscribe right now, because today we are breaking down Bleeding Steel, the Jackie Chan movie that starts as a cop thriller and somehow ends up as a battle against a nude cyborg on top of what can only be described as a star destroyer, and I promise you every single word of that sentence is completely accurate. The story opens in Hong Kong, and right from the very first scene, the film throws its protagonist into an impossible situation that tells you everything you need to know about who Lin Dong is as a person. He's a Hong Kong special agent racing through traffic toward a hospital where his young daughter 1111 is fighting for her life against leukemia, her condition having taken a sudden, critical turn for the worse. Lin has a giant stuffed teddy bear strapped into the passenger seat of his car, the kind of detail that immediately establishes this as a man who, underneath whatever professional hardness his job requires, is above all else just a father desperately trying to get to his sick child in time, and then his phone rings. His colleague Xiao Su is calling to tell him that Dr. James, an important witness in an active case, is in immediate danger and needs extraction right now. The unit is already moving, but they need Lin on the scene. What would you do in that moment, with your daughter in a hospital bed and your job pulling you in the exact opposite direction? Lin stops his car directly outside the hospital entrance, sits there for a long, agonizing second, staring at those doors, and then drives away to meet his unit. It's one of those choices you understand completely even as it breaks something inside you to watch, the professional obligation overriding the personal one in the way that certain jobs demand, and the cost of that choice is going to define the entire rest of this story.dr. James, it turns out, is not just any witness. He's a brilliant geneticist who has spent years working on research into human biological enhancement specifically aimed at regeneration, the ability to heal and survive injuries that would ordinarily be fatal, theoretically creating soldiers who are essentially impossible to kill permanently. The practical results of this research include a mechanical heart capable of sustaining human life indefinitely and a biogenetic blood substitute that carries regenerative properties directly encoded into its chemistry. Before leaving his lab, James injects himself with this blood substitute and takes the mechanical heart with him, apparently understanding that whatever is coming for him is going to be bad enough that these precautions are necessary. Lin Dong's unit escorts Dr. James away from the location. They are hit by an ambush that none of them were remotely prepared for. The attackers are a squad of men wearing exotic black tactical armor and carrying weapons far beyond anything standard criminal organizations would have access to. They move with a precision and lethality that immediately signals military training of the highest order. And leading them is a man named Andre, who is immediately established as something beyond ordinary physical capability, absorbing gunfire and direct impacts that would drop any normal person, throwing vehicles and officers aside with the force of something that only loosely resembles a human being anymore. What do you think it takes to stop someone like that when conventional weapons are doing essentially nothing? Lin improvises, managing to get Andre positioned near a vehicle just as he triggers an explosion, the blast powerful enough to send Andre crashing down hard. Most of the unit is dead by the time the smoke clears. Lin is severely wounded.
Xiao Su barely survives.
And Lin, lying gravely injured in the wreckage of the operation, receives a phone call. Dr. James answers it on his behalf. 1111 has died at the hospital. The grief of that moment is almost impossible to sit with cleanly, because Lin made a choice, chose the job over his daughter, and arrived too late to see her one last time. That weight is going to follow him for the next 13 years without resolution or comfort. But here's the detail that slowly, quietly changes everything. Both Lin and Andre survive the explosion, though Andre's injuries from the blast are catastrophic enough that the only way to keep him functional afterward is through extensive cybernetic modification, turning him into something that sits in the territory between human being and machine in ways that only become fully clear much later in the story. And Dr. James, dying from his own wounds in the aftermath, does something extraordinary with the time he has left. Using the mechanical heart and the biogenetic blood substitute he'd brought with him, he performs an emergency procedure on 1111, essentially attempting to reverse what the leukemia and the hospital had already confirmed was her death. The blood substitute, carrying James's own genetic memories encoded within its chemistry, is infused into her system alongside the mechanical heart, and against everything that medicine and logic would suggest is possible, it works. 1111 lives, but the cost of that survival is her memory. Whatever the procedure does to restore her biological functions, it wipes her identity completely clean, leaving her with no recollection of her father, her name, her history, or any of the events surrounding that night. For her own safety, she's placed in an orphanage and given a new name, Nancy. And Lin Dong, knowing she's alive but understanding that her safety depends on nobody being able to connect her to the events Dr. James was involved in, makes the extraordinary decision to watch over her from a distance, secretly, for 13 years, never allowing her to know who he is. Think about what that actually means in practical terms. He spends over a decade operating as a secret guardian to a young woman who doesn't know he exists, never getting to be her father openly, never getting to explain any of it, just maintaining a quiet, invisible protective presence in the background of her life. At one point during these 13 years, he works undercover in her school cafeteria just to be near her, and in a detail so gloriously self-aware that it has to be intentional, his name tag at that cafeteria job reads Jackie Chan. The film just does that and moves on without comment. 13 years later, the story relocates to Sydney, Australia, where Nancy is now a young woman in her early 20s, living what looks like an ordinary student life but haunted constantly by vivid, disturbing nightmares. In these dreams, she sees a laboratory, scientific equipment, procedures being performed, images and memories that don't belong to her own life but feel overwhelmingly real. She visits a spiritualist trying to make sense of them, and that spiritualist, recognizing how unusual and specific these visions are, eventually describes them to a local author named Rick Rogers. Rogers, a science fiction writer, finds the material compelling enough to write a novel around it, titled, naturally, Bleeding Steel, about a Marine implanted with a mechanical heart. The book is published, becomes modestly successful, and immediately draws attention from exactly the wrong kinds of people. 3 separate parties descend on Rogers almost simultaneously the night the story picks back up. A young man named Lee Sen, disguised as a woman, breaks into Rogers's hotel room, drugs him, and downloads everything on his computer before the evening's other visitors arrive. A woman known only as the Woman in Black, who serves as Andre's primary enforcer, storms the building with backup and tortures Rogers to extract the source of his inspiration. And Lin Dong, still monitoring anything that might connect back to 1111 or Dr. James's research, also shows up to ask Rogers the same question, resulting in a 3-way confrontation that's chaotic, visually inventive, and absolutely refuses to explain itself before you've had a chance to fully process what you're watching. The Woman in Black returns to Andre's headquarters, which is a flying airship hovering somewhere above Sydney, because apparently in this story's version of the near future, a former Special Forces soldier turned cyborg can simply have one of those. Andre, who has spent 13 years tracking Dr. James's research with the specific motivation of getting his hands on whatever keeps his deteriorating cybernetic body functional, identifies both Lin Dong and Lee Sen from security footage and sent his enforcer after Lee Sen specifically. What is Lee Sen's actual deal? This takes a while to fully clarify, but his motivations are considerably more layered than his initial appearance as a quirky tech criminal suggests. He's the son of the arms dealer who originally funded Dr. James's research, the same arms dealer Andre murdered along with his entire family after the experimental procedure on Andre failed and left his cells slowly consuming themselves from the inside. Lee Sen has spent years planning to get close enough to Andre to take personal revenge for what was done to his family, and his interest in Rogers's book is part of that longer game. There's also a genuine affection for Nancy running underneath his calculated agenda, the two of them having been friends at the orphanage where she grew up, and that affection ends up mattering more than his revenge scheme by the time everything plays out. Lin and Lee Sen's separate investigations both lead them to Nancy, and they reach her just ahead of the Woman in Black's attempt to take her. Between the two of them, they manage to get Nancy to safety, and it's during this period that the full truth about who Nancy actually is finally gets explained. How do you think Nancy reacts to being told that she is actually a dead girl who was resurrected by a dying scientist, that her nightmares are someone else's memories encoded into the artificial blood keeping her alive, and that the mechanical heart beating inside her chest is the exact thing a cyborg warlord in a flying airship has been hunting for 13 years? The answer is not great, honestly, which is completely understandable. Lin takes both Nancy and Lee Sen to his house, which turns out to be equipped with a level of security technology that makes it look less like a private residence and more like a covert operations facility. He explains everything to Nancy, who she really is, who he is, What happened the night Dr. James saved her life, and why he's been watching over her from a distance all these years without ever introducing himself. Does that revelation resolve cleanly and emotionally in the way you'd expect from a father-daughter reunion story? This film doesn't really have time for clean emotional resolutions. Andre's operation is closing in. The spiritualist Nancy had been visiting is found murdered. Clearly a message about how quickly the situation is escalating. And the entire sequence of events is moving toward a confrontation that Lin has apparently been preparing for since the night he survived that first ambush more than a decade ago. Lin tries to keep Nancy safe and get his unit back together for what he clearly understands is coming. Nancy starts grappling with the memories she carries that don't belong to her. Dr. James's experiences, encoded into the blood substitute that brought her back to life, surface in fragments, giving her access to knowledge and emotional echoes of a man she never met. It's a genuinely strange and melancholy element of the story, the idea that the price of resurrection is carrying someone else's inner life alongside your own. The woman in black continues pressing her pursuit across Sydney, leading to a series of action sequences that work their way through increasingly dramatic locations. There's a confrontation at Sydney's Opera House that manages to be both visually spectacular and completely inexplicable in terms of how or why anyone ended up there. There's a chase and fight sequence through streets and across rooftops that allows the film to show off the location work in Sydney properly while also demonstrating that Lin Dong, even at the age he's operating at by this point in the story, remains genuinely dangerous in close-quarters combat. Andre, growing impatient with his enforcer's repeated failures to secure Nancy, finally decides to handle things himself, bringing his entire airship operation into direct play for the film's final confrontation. And this is where Bleeding Steel commits fully and unapologetically to being exactly the kind of film it actually is, because what follows is a battle aboard Andre's flying vessel against cybernetically enhanced soldiers that looks like someone took the aesthetic of an 80s sci-fi movie, pushed everything slightly past the point of reason, and then decided the final boss fight should happen on something that strongly resembles a star destroyer from a galaxy far, far away. Andre himself, by this point in the film, has committed entirely to the full cyborg aesthetic that his original injuries and subsequent modifications demanded. He's pale, partially armored, physically imposing beyond anything that human biology alone would produce, and during the climactic confrontation, the film takes him to a place that defies easy description. Let's simply say the final fight happens with Andre in a state that makes it very clear the production crew had absolutely no intention of making any conventional choices about how to stage this ending. What Lin actually does to defeat Andre in that final confrontation is the kind of thing that has to be seen rather than described to be fully appreciated, not because it's particularly elegant or emotionally satisfying in any traditional narrative sense, but because it represents the film's total commitment to its own bizarre internal logic. The action beats leading up to it include Lin using his environment in ways that feel improvised under pressure rather than carefully choreographed, which is honestly more interesting than polished perfection would have been at that point in the story. With Andre finally and definitively finished, the immediate threat to Nancy is eliminated. Lin gets to exist openly as her father for the first time since she was a small child. No more watching from cafeterias with other people's name tags, no more distance enforced by the necessity of keeping her identity hidden. Lin, having been a somewhat chaotic presence throughout the entire second half of the film, ends the story in a morally ambiguous position that the film treats as quietly satisfying rather than problematic, alive, in possession of Dr. James's research data, and apparently choosing not to sell it to the highest bidder in the immediate aftermath, shown in Norway having declined an offer from a potential buyer before signing off in a way that suggests his adventure is far from over. Lin reunites with Xiao Su and what remains of his original unit. Nancy, for the first time since her resurrection, has context for the nightmares that have followed her entire adult life. The mechanical heart keeps beating. Everyone who needed to survive has survived. Now here's my honest take on this film, because it genuinely deserves one. Bleeding Steel is a deeply strange, frequently incoherent, and occasionally completely deranged piece of cinema that simultaneously fails at almost everything it attempts with any seriousness and somehow remains more entertaining than a film this objectively messy has any business being. The plot makes essentially no effort to establish its own rules clearly before breaking them, jumps between tones without signaling transitions, and introduces elements like the flying airship, the biogenetic, blood memories, and the cybernetic supersoldiers with a casualness that suggests the screenwriters assumed the audience would simply keep up rather than stopping to ask reasonable questions about how any of this actually functions. And yet, There's something genuinely affecting in the film's emotional core, the image of a father who chose his job over his dying daughter, then spent 13 years quietly guarding a girl who doesn't know who he is, never getting to be her father because keeping her safe requires him to be invisible. That's a genuinely sad premise buried underneath all the cyberpunk excess, and whenever the film pauses long enough to let it breathe, you feel the weight of it. Jackie Chan himself is doing legitimate dramatic work here in ways that audiences who only know his earlier comedy action persona might not expect. There's real grief in how he plays Lin Dong throughout, a man carrying something heavy for a very long time, and that performance holds up even when everything happening around her has detached completely from any recognizable logic. The action sequences are competent rather than exceptional, which is probably the harshest accurate criticism you can make of a Jackie Chan film from any era. The choreography doesn't have the inventive physical comedy that defined his peak work, but given the cyberpunk sci-fi framing and the demands of the story, what's here serves its purpose adequately enough to not embarrass anyone involved. Is Bleeding Steel a good film? By conventional measures, not really. Is it an interesting film? A genuinely bizarre artifact of late-career Jackie Chan that goes places no reasonable person would have predicted from the premise? Without question, what do you think is more impressive? That Jackie Chan is still performing his own stunt work well into his 60s, or that the production team looked at a script containing a flying airship, a nude cyborg final boss, and a resurrection via mechanical heart, and decided all of that was completely reasonable to include in the same movie? Let me know in the comments if you enjoyed this breakdown, hit like and subscribe, because there are plenty more gloriously strange action films ahead just waiting to be unpacked scene by scene.